Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Soli J. Sorabjee Excellence Award and Scholarship and Memorial Lecture. I extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished guests and members of the audience who have joined us today. I am so pleased to welcome our chief guest for this morning, Honorable Justice K.V. Viswanathan, Judge, Supreme Court of India. I am also delighted to welcome Mr. R. Venkataramani, Attorney General of India, Ms. Madhavi Divan, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, Mr. Satvik Varma, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India. I also warmly welcome Professor C. Raj Kumar, Vice Chancellor, O.P. Jindal Global University, Professor Sridhar Patnaik, Registrar, O.P. Jindal Global University, and Professor S.G. Sreejith, Executive Dean, Jindal Global Law School. I also extend a very warm welcome to everyone who has joined us via simultaneous broadcast on YouTube. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. I invite Professor Dr. C. Raj Kumar, Vice Chancellor, O.P. Jindal Global University, to please present the welcome address.
Thank you very much, Surabhi. First of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all our distinguished guests here to be present on this very special occasion, and of course at the JGU International Academy here at Taj. In fact, this is a very special occasion because Mr. Sorabjee has impacted so many of our lives in so many different ways. So I want to first of all mention that he is one of those individuals who, anybody who has interacted with him at some point of time would know that he made those interactions very special, even casual interactions. And I will tell you a little bit about my own experiences. I want to take this moment to extend a warm welcome to our Chief Guest, Honorable Mr. Justice K.V. Viswanathan, Judge, Supreme Court of India, who readily accepted when we invited him to deliver this Soli Sorabjee Memorial Lecture. And as a part of that lecture, we have this Excellence Award and Scholarship, which has been instituted by a very good friend and a distinguished lawyer, Mr. Satvik Varma. So thank you so much, Satvik, for your contribution, indeed your deep commitment to advancing the cause of legal education and legal profession. I also want to recognize the presence of our distinguished lawyer as well as the Attorney General for India, Mr. R. Venkataramani, for taking time out to reflect on Mr. Sorabjee's life in the course of the panel discussion that we'll have shortly. Thank you so much, Ms. Madhavi Divan, for your presence. I know that all of you are very busy individuals, and I see a galaxy of people representing the legal profession, the academia, and young lawyers and distinguished senior counsels, those who represent law firms and other corporations. I know that all of you might have at some point of time been deeply influenced by this extraordinary man. I don't plan to talk about his contributions in the field of law. I want to say that he's very special to me for a very different reason. In the year 1998, I appeared before the Rhodes Scholarship Selection Committee, and he was the chairman of the selection committee, and he selected me along with 10 others as a Rhodes Scholar. And I remember that Rhodes has a tradition where before the interview that happens one day from morning till evening, there is a dinner that's held the previous night. And there are a lot of anxiety and rumors about whether the dinner will also constitute a part of the selection process, or that we can just assume that it wouldn't be. But Mr. Sorabjee, I met him for the first time in the year 1997, December, in Kolkata, as a part of that process. And he made me and everybody else so comfortable by his usual chatty approach, his sense of humility, his deep commitment towards understanding what the other person is doing, regardless of whichever, we were just young students. I was a final year student at the Campus Law Center, Faculty of Law, University of Delhi. So he made that effort to connect with me as a person And since then, of course, I had the privilege to host him later at Harvard Law School as a young student. In April 2000, we did a major conference on human rights in Indian judiciary's constitutional jurisprudence. And it was a very historic conference because Mr. Sorabjee had already become the Attorney General at that time. And Mr. Ram Jethmalani was the Law Minister at that time. And both of them were at the conference in April 2000 at Harvard Law School. Not only the two of them, we had Granville Austin, Mark Galanter, and none other than Justice Krishnaiyer. And all these amazing people from India and around the world conglomerated at Harvard Law School. And I spent those 4 or 5 days very closely interacting with Mr. Sorabjee. And all of that left me with an indelible impression about this extraordinary man who we have only read his contributions in the field of law, from Sunil Batra to Menaka Gandhi to so many other things, which I'm sure this audience knows it better. I also want to mention that years later, we've had the privilege to know each other, and when the university was being established, I made it a point to spend a lot of time talking to him about the idea of a global law school and what we were trying to do here, and he was simply nothing but supportive and constantly encouraging and, of course, inspiring. So I want to say that OP Jindal Global University and Jindal Global Law School owes a huge debt of intellectual gratitude to Mr. Soli Sorabjee for inspiring, for supporting, for guiding, for encouraging, for literally walking with us through those years. And I know that later years, when we were up and running, he was deeply appreciative of what we were trying to do and never hesitated to accept an invitation from us. So once again, I want to pay special tribute to this man. I also want to recognize the presence of Zena Sorabjee. Thank you very much, ma'am, for taking the effort to come all the way from Mumbai to be present on this occasion as we celebrate the life and contribution of Mr. Soli Sorabjee. I want to end by saying that this effort to memorialize but also celebrate Mr. Sorabjee is part of an effort that we have undertaken at OP Jindal Global University, Jindal Global Law School. We have instituted few such endowments, recognizing the contributions of few judges, including Justice B.R. Krishnaiyer, Justice P.N. Bhagwati, and a few other lawyers. But Mr. Sorabjee, in many ways, not only had cut across different generations of the legal world and also the world of judiciary, but also he was one of those persons who also transcended the world of law and legal profession and academia. His huge contributions to the field of international law, international human rights law, is something that not many people in the Indian legal profession are aware of. And as a human rights lawyer myself, I was deeply inspired by that work he undertook at the United Nations, as well as the UN Subcommission for the Protection of Human Rights, as well as for many years serving on a number of UN committees besides his important work here in India itself. So with those words, I want to stop here and thank you for your presence here. This JGU International Academy, we recently set up nearly 6 months ago. And the vision of this academy is to be able to have a private space for fostering public good. And this is exactly the kind of initiatives that we want to promote in this facility. I invite you to join us and be part of this effort to build a vibrant intellectual tradition and culture here in Delhi, besides, of course, our campus itself. So thank you so much for all of your presence and participation in today's event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. It was so wonderful to hear about your interactions with Mr. Sorabjee. I now invite Professor S.G. Sreejith, Executive Dean, Jindal Global Law School, to please share the introductory remarks.
Very good morning to everybody, esteemed and distinguished audience. I take this opportunity to welcome all of you on behalf of Jindal Global Law School, which had the honor to host this lecture, and also OP Jindal Global University. I know that there are many memory-filled hearts in this audience, erudite tongues, and expressive minds that can wax eloquent about the life and work of Mr. Soli Sorabjee. And I'm very small in that larger scheme of things. But I would like to talk a little bit about my institution's initiative to organize this distinguished lecture series. OP Jindal Global University has the practice of honoring well-lived lives, not just by way of remembrances, but as also as ways to remember those noble and departed souls who left behind trails to follow. When we thought about these kind of distinguished lecture series, we thought in the same vein as Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. The question is, what makes these remembrances so relevant? I would like to look back or look at the time in which we live. This is a quite mysterious age when we feel a strangeness to our own mind. Absolutely alien, unfamiliar conditions all around. Moments are absolutely disconnected. There is a lack of incoherence. There's a lack of coherence. There is ambivalence all around. This unknownness which we face, the unbearable lightness of being, if I may borrow the title of Milan Kundera's novel, which we experience, the collective vertigo which humanity goes through, there is a formlessness in everything which we perceive. We are like floating beings in an indeterminate world. What we need is solace. What we need is consolation. What we need is depth, which could bring certain weight to this lightness which we are experiencing. I just remember on this point when I mentioned about depth, a popular novel by Haruki Murakami, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, the protagonist goes in search of peace in the depth of a dry well. He finds inspiration. He finds meanings to all the incoherences he faced in the depth of that well. I would say that wells of depth from which springs the elixir of life, drinking of which might infuse us with hope. We find the depth in the well-lived lives of these individuals in whose honor we organize these distinguished lectures. Now, this distinguished memorial lecture is also such a journey into the depth of a well, the well of a well-lived life. They're willing and acting in the society, in their values and principles, in their convictions and determinations, and most importantly, in their benedictions. This distinguished memorial lecture is aptly titled on such a hope, such a depth, Soli, the devoted constitutionalist. Constitutionalism, of course, we may give many definitions to that. It could be the subconscious sentiment which keeps us going. It's probably a subconscious adherence to the values of the Constitution, but I've always deemed constitutionalism as that absolute consciousness that we aspire for in an age of ambivalence, in an age of indeterminacy. This is the only hope we have today. It calms, it comforts, and it assures that we don't live in times of kings of history who could have deprived us of a life any time at their sweet will, because we have a constitution to protect us, our lives, our personal liberties. We live in the maternity of democracy, in the paternity of egalitarianism, and under the tutelage of the Constitution. So rights, privileges, guarantees, freedoms, and duties. Constitution is very much our mother. And as much as the mother is, and as much true the mother's love is, Constitution is also an undeniable truth. So is constitutionalism. So it is this consciousness I understand that Mr. Sorabjee had, even though I regret in my life I could not meet him, even though heard a lot about his work and have great acquaintance with what he wrote and spoke. It is this constitutionalism Mr. Soli Sorabjee had, which many learned minds in this hall have, and what students like me aspire for. Many of you are fortunate to have that constitutional mindset, but students of law like me aspire for that. In Jindal Global Law School and OB Jindal Global University, we promise that we'll do our best to keep up this education and constitutional values alive. This is our desire for salvation. This is our desire to live. This is our desire to stay alive. Thank you very much, but I would like to conclude here by saying that the great masters continue to speak through these lectures, and I have found a beautiful poem by Khalil Gibran, which probably might be a little apt in this situation. And though the death may hide me, and the greater silence enfolds me, I'll seek your understanding. And not in vain will I seek, if aught I have said is truth, that truth shall revert itself in a clearer voice and in words more kin to your thoughts. May the departed soul in whose name this distinguished lecture is organized, and the departed souls in whose name these distinguished lectures are organized, bestow their benedictions on us. May the eternal force, the never-ending spirit, the bliss of existence be with all of us. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Sreejith. I am now pleased to invite Mr. Satvik Varma, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, to please share his reflections on Mr. Soli J. Sorabjee's life and contribution. Welcome, sir.
Soli would have been very, very disappointed today. Extremely. The reason I say that is I've been asked to talk about Mr. Sorabjee's contributions. And I think one of his greatest contributions was his struggles to achieve equality. And the reason I say he would have been disappointed is because the way the room has been divided. The men are on one side and the women are on the other. And he would, well, barring a few exceptions. Yes. Thank you, Meenakshi, you just came in. But I think this is something that he would have. We've come here to listen to Justice Viswanathan. I thank the judges from the Delhi High Court here, the Attorney General, various other senior lawyers, my parents, and most importantly, Auntie Zina, who flew in from Bombay, especially for this. Raj asked me to speak in this opening couple of minute session on what prompted me to set up this scholarship for 20 years in Soli's memory and this award. Soli went in the middle of the pandemic, and I say Soli only out of love and not out of any disrespect, but he went in the middle of the pandemic. And during the pandemic, I got to spend a lot of time with him. And in all of those interactions, it just reminded me on how much he wanted to help the cause of law. Soli was a first-generation lawyer. He didn't come from a family of lawyers, businessman, but he was absolutely wedded to the idea of encouraging young lawyers and mentoring lawyers. And the proof of the pudding lies in its eating. Today, some of our most distinguished lawyers have at some point of time either been at Soli's chamber or came in close contact with him, working deeply in cases. And so when I discussed this idea immediately, almost 10 days after Soli's death with Auntie, and when the dust was settling, the idea was to keep his contributions and memories alive. We don't need a scholarship alone for that, but I thought that that would be one way of doing it. And so the scholarship and the Excellence Award is awarded, and I presume they're here, to a student on Soli's most chosen topic, which is human rights. And for the remainder of 20 years, Soli's legacy, which will live in all of the decisions that he sort of argued and participated in, but through this very small measure, it will also stay alive with this human rights scholar at India's leading law school, Jindal Global Law, and we seek to keep that alive. And I thank you all for coming. I'm going to keep it brief here. We're here to hear more distinguished people. Thank you for coming, and I'll save all my other thoughts for later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Varma. I am delighted to invite our chief guest, Honorable Justice K.V. Viswanathan, Judge, Supreme Court of India, to please present the Soli J. Sorabjee Memorial Lecture. Welcome, sir.
At the outset, let me congratulate OP Jindal Global Law University, Dr. Raj Kumar and Satvik for organizing this lecture and for the Soli Sorabjee Excellence Award and Scholarship. I think it's a wonderful tribute to a great individual. I'm also deeply honored to be invited to speak to you about Soli being a devoted constitutionalist. I am additionally honored by the distinguished presence of Ms. Zena Sorabjee, who's come all the way from Bombay, with the presence of all of you, judges of the Delhi High Court, distinguished senior lawyers, my esteemed friends. I first saw Soli on a TV panel discussion. And that is why, Ms. Zena, I was able to relate to your candid piece in Sudesh Pai's Fed Shrift about how Soli liked being on TV panels. But what was significant about that discussion, I just come back from college in Coimbatore. It was 6 or 6:30 in the evening. We had only Doordarshan 1 and Doordarshan 2. On Doordarshan 1 was a panel discussion of 3 eminent lawyers, Soli anchoring it in the middle, Dr. Singhvi on the right, and Mr. Sanghi to his left. And the topic was about the then raging episode of the president dithering on the signing of one of the bills. So the issue was about the role of the president under the Indian Constitution. And 36 years down the line, the one phrase that Soli mentioned in that discussion, which has stuck, was that the president under the Indian Constitution has to sign or resign. In the typical Soli style, he said. I think he summed up aid and advice, the role of the president, the Westminster model. What Justice Krishnaya said in Samsher Singh, not the Potomac, but the Thames that fertilizes the Yamuna, if we can adopt a riverine imagery, was fine for legal scholars, those informed in literature, but Soli had a knack of simplifying the hardcore, abstract, constitutional concept, and that still has stuck in my mind. So speaking of Soli as a devoted constitutionalist is only difficult for the reason that most of you know what Soli's contribution is. But how can one make it interesting? What is the aspect that I personally saw in Soli, which went on to, mold his conduct in life, his arguments in court, which ultimately got translated into the judgments of the court? I think you'll find that the one underlying concept in all of these cases, some of which we'll have to necessarily refer to, it might sound repetitive for you, it might sound, sometimes mundane, but we can't avoid referring. I won't refer to a whole host of them, but something to make the point is that there was this element of fairness. His default rule appears to me that he tested the action, his arguments, his conduct, his statements from the anvil of fairness. And if it passed that muster, then he would advance it. So much so that even if it was not to, succeed for the case party that he was appearing, it did not matter to him. And we'll see what some judges had to say, some of which you would have said. I must confess at the very outset that I have liberally consulted from 3 works for whatever I am going to talk to you. Distinguished senior lawyer and commentator Sudesh Pai's Fate Shrift, found it a wonderful piece. Abhinav Chandrachud's biography on Soli. And I'm glad Praveen Bhai is here. His compilation from the Confederation of Indian Bar. Because the idea was to present to the audience some nuggets, some nuances, which perhaps is not as well known. It's difficult, with Soli, everybody knows everything about him. So in that, with that background, if one may begin. Soli saw the profession as a great calling. He would often quote Roscoe Pound, who said, historically there are 3 ideas involved in a profession: organization, learning, and a spirit of public service. These are essential. The remaining idea, that of gaining livelihood, is incidental. I think that is how Soli practiced it. That is what he preached. And that was also the underlying basis for the way he conducted himself. And a reading of the biographical sketches, the anecdotes, indicate that Soli had certain inherent constitutional values. So even if we were not to have a written constitution, Soli would still have been a constitutionalist. His contribution is so vast that you find his footprints across different spectrums in the Constitution. So, if I may cull out as to what I find, he was a respecter of human rights, as Dr. Raj Kumar and Dr. Sreejith and Satvik mentioned. He was a defender of human liberties. He was a votary for the basic structure. He was a champion of federalism. He was a defender of minority rights. He was a strong advocate for free and fair election. He was an inveterate traveler who zealously guarded the right to travel, a die-hard enemy of arbitrariness, a leader of the bar who fought for independence of judiciary, a constitutional scholar who wore the rule of law as his badge of honor, and above all, a constitutional moralist to the core. You are already wondering, how did he leave out free speech? How can I leave that out? Soli was almost obsessively possessed, as he was possessively obsessed about free speech. It was not that he did not want others to canvass free speech rights, but somehow, when you watched him appear in Orevoru Gramathile or in Bandit Queen, you got this feeling, which was unavoidable, that if Article 19(1)A was in a cubicle, the only other person who could be there was Sorabjee. He was a strong votary for Voltaire's oft-quoted statement that I may not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So how did Soli, as a champion of free speech, how can we illustrate them? Some of them I will set out, most of them you are aware, but I will also punctuate a case with which I am going to refer with some of his writings, either before or after it, to show what was the underpinning behind his arguments, behind his submissions. Abhinav Chandrachud, in his interesting book, Soli Sorabjee, Life and Times, cites the interesting case of the Freedom First Journal of Minu Masani. Now, the case as such may be known, but there was an article which he refers to, which Soli wrote, which makes for very interesting reading. Minoche Masani was a member of the Constituent Assembly. He edited an English journal called Freedom First. Because of pre-censorship during the 1976 emergency, Masani submitted to the state censor the entire journal that he wished to publish. The censor forbade him from printing 11 articles. Masani challenged the order before the Bombay High Court. Soli represented him and succeeded before the single bench. However, the state went in appeal to the division bench. The matter was heard before Justices Madden and Justice Kania, and Soli argued fervently before the division bench. 2 days before the Freedom First judgment was to be delivered, Soli wrote an article, Preserve the Courts. I just see the powerful words, that are mentioned in that article, which brings out what Soli really as a person was. It was written on 8th February 1976. He highlighted the importance the courts were during the emergency. Much more attractive than, that amidst the clash of arms, the laws of England are not silent, what Lord Atkins said. Look at what Soli said. Doctors capriciously refused passports, petty traders illegally deprived of licenses, government servants wrongfully removed, innocent persons illegally detained, and the countless victims of discrimination, all of them, he wrote, beholden to fearless judges. It was the independent court of law which prevented rule of law being supplanted by the rule of the lathi. The verdict came in favor of Minoshar Masani. The Bombay High Court held in appeal that though the fundamental right to free speech has been suspended during emergency, Masani was still entitled to challenge the censorship of his newspaper on the ground that none of the articles were prejudicial to the internal security of India. Mrs. Madden held that though India was in a state of emergency, the rule of law continues to prevail and allowed Masani to publish all except 2 of the 11 articles. The cases of Ramesh versus Union of India, about the test that you apply, about the test of the strong-minded, firm and courageous man and not from the standpoint of the weak, and the Bandit Queen, which said that we do not censor to protect the pervert or to assuage the susceptibilities of the oversensitive. The work of art should be judged from the point of view of a reasonable person. These are Soli's arguments getting reflected in his judgments. And Soli wrote after the case that a resounding vindication of cherished fundamental right to freedom of expression and rebuff to prudery. Equally so in the case of Rangarajan versus in the Rangarajan case, the Ore Oru Gramathile case, Jagjeevan Ram, I think, I was present in court, was argued in what is now court number 8. Then I think it was court number 6 because the numbering had changed. He argued that court should not be concerned with the correctness of views expressed in the film, and the court cannot limit expression on any general issue, even if it is controversial. Soli was, of course, part of the Shreya Singhal case, and all of this is well known. But how would Soli have reacted to vile or vituperative speech? Soli had expressly condemned, though a strong votary of free speech, Soli never, for the life of him, accepted what is now come to be known as hate speech. Criticism is permissible, provided it does not descend to vile or vituperative abuse, is what Soli wrote. And I make bold to say that Soli as a judge, if he were one, would have been receptive to an argument that vile, vituperative and hate speech is they not just incite violence, they are violence per se. It is verbal violence. The great saint poet Thiruvalluvar, I will read the Tamil version and then translate for you, said, Thiyinar suttabun ullarum, arade navinar suttavadu. Translated to English would mean, the wound burnt with fire may heal, but wound inflicted by the tongue will never heal. The intangible violence perhaps may not be unknown to constitutional law. Even the great Bhagavad Gita, contrasting the difference between the funeral fire and the mental worry, said, Chita chinta dvayur madhya, Chita tatra garyasi, Chita dagati nirjivan, Chinta dagati sajivakam. While the funeral fire burns only the dead body, the mental worry burns the living one. So there again you will find the reference to the intangible nature of hurt, intangible nature of the mental worry, as much as intangible nature of hurt. So Soli would have been very receptive to the argument. Yes, advocacy can't be proscribed. It needs to incite violence. We have followed Brandenburg, Ohio in Shreya Singhal and other cases. But should it be that you should lift your arm and thump the shoulder and is that alone violence? It will be not just incitement to violence, it will be violence per se, verbal violence. And it would never pass muster in Soli's, in Soli's life. It also strikes at the very root of fraternity. Fraternity, in my view, is the most significant value set out at the very outset in the preamble. And our great country has been witness to examples of fraternity in the 75, 73 years that we have been republic, the 75 years that we have been independent, the Constitution, 75 years with the Constitution. There have been several instances, but never was fraternity in its full blossom during the pandemic. And it shouldn't be that we will display fraternity only if there is a pandemic. And I think that is one value which Soli cherished, and it is one value that we should all cherish. How did Soli, look at rule of law? So we move on from free speech to his other favorite constitutional values. Soli spoke at the K.T. Desai Memorial Lecture on the rule of law. I would like to emphasize that the rule of law is not a mere legalistic slogan. It embodies a noble concept. It denotes a way of life, commitment to certain principles and values. So everything to Soli was not just arguments in court, reference to articles, reference to authorities. It is the way you carried your life, and that's, I think, was the distinctive feature of Soli. He was inherently fair. We'll come to his days as the law officer a little later, because it won't be complete unless you refer to that. This concept of Soli is also the concept that Justice Matthews said in Indira Gandhi. I cannot conceive rule of law as a twinkling star up above the Constitution. To be a basic structure, it must be a terrestrial concept having its habitat within the four corners of the Constitution. And for Soli, it was within the four corners of the human body. He practiced rule of law. Soli was an inveterate traveler. Many who have written have mentioned about Soli's visits, with the first port of call always being London. But Soli's, goodwill, the popularity of Soli, I realized on a train journey. Coming back from Chandigarh, seated next to me was a businessman from Pune. We got chatting before he disclosed his name. He said he was Harbans Singh Sani, a diamond merchant of Pune, and he said, do you know Soli Sorabjee? I said, of course, who doesn't know Soli Sorabjee? He said he handled my brother's case, and that was Satwan Singh Sani's case. So in Satwan Singh Sani, Soli argued that liberty under Article 21 included the right to obtain a passport and the right to travel abroad. Soli said executive action must be free from arbitrariness, and the rule of law requires that any executive action which prejudicially affects the right of a citizen must be pursuant to law. The Supreme Court accepted it by a majority. Equally so in Maneka Gandhi, many of you know, I don't want to deal with it. Soli had, as Sudesh describes in his book, S.V. Gupta had said I wouldn't, even defend it. Soli had to step in as the Solicitor General. Soli gave what was an acceptable order for the government, and Soli had himself worked out what fairness would be, etc., and that ultimately was over. But there's an interesting episode, and these episodes are important, not just the cases. It appears when ADM Jabalpur was pronounced, Soli was at the Taj, Bombay, with Nani Palkiwala when he received the telephone and the news of the judgment. It is Mahalakshmi Pavani who writes in the Confederation of the Indian Bar article, and I must acknowledge it to her as the source, that speaking at the National Law School, Soli confessed that when he heard what the judgment was, he wept. There were tears rolling down his cheeks. Now, I think this is what brings out the constitutional moralist in the individual. It's not just, setting out a few propositions, backing it up with American judgments, what you inherently feel about it. And I was at the new Parliament Annex. Krishna was 85 in perhaps 2000. Yes. There was an 85th birthday for Krishna, and just as Krishna has said, I used to wonder how it could be true. He said, for a person to be a good judge, he must be the capacity to weep, he said. how can an objective judge weep is what I used to wonder. But what he meant was, once the injustice is manifested and you want to now set it right, sometimes you feel you're helpless about it, sometimes you want to make amends. He says the judge must have a capacity to weep. And I think this weeping is not a weakness. Weeping for the right cause can be a sign of strength. And that, I think, Soli displayed. And a couple of other articles referring to Soli's, nature of welling up. Mr. Chagla writes that when reference came to any death of his friends, Soli would instantly well up. So I think Soli has demonstrated that crying or weeping may not be always a sign of weakness. Weeping for the right cause could be a sign of strength, and it shows the measure of the man. Soli was a strong advocate for federalism. So much so that Dr. Jahangir Sorabjee, his son, rightly mentions in his tribute to his father that after the S.R. Bommai case, Soli was nicknamed Mr. 356. In Bommai, as you all know, the Supreme Court declared that the state government could be dismissed invoking power under 356 only if there is a constitutional impasse that the government cannot be carried on in accordance with the law, that while sufficiency of material cannot be questioned, the legitimacy of the inference can. All these are legal propositions for you to read, but look at the tribute my esteemed and revered senior Mr. K.K. Venugopal paid after the Bommai judgment came. And I think that also sums up Soli's personality. Decisions like Bommai, where Soli's constitutional philosophy and advocacy moved the court, stand testament to his greatness. Bommai was a significant feather in his cap, and I believe he put in tremendous effort in arguing that case. The principles that he was able to persuade the court to lay down in that case have served to safeguard the federal architecture of our constitution and to stop the unfortunate abuse of the power to dismiss state governments, which was till then almost commonplace. I think that put a speed breaker, that put a roadblock on the frequent resort to 356 that was carried forward to the next level in Rameshwar Prasad. Some years back, reading a set of articles on English administrative law, I came across a tribute by the great Lord Coke of Thorndon to Lord Reid. And I thought that somehow perfectly fitted the bill for Sorabjee. Lord Coke said that Lord Reid was the midwife for the birth of administrative law in the 60s in England. And he referred to Ridge versus Baldwin and those line of cases. I think it could be safely said, without fear of contradiction, that Soli was the midwife for the birth and growth of public law between the mid-60s to up to the the early part of the present century. Soli was a strong proponent of the theory of natural justice. Sudhish mentions in his book that Soli appeared in S.L. Kapoor versus Jagmohan, the famous NDMC supersession case, and successfully argued for the petitioner that merely because facts are admitted or are indisputable, it does not follow that natural justice needs not be observed, echoing very much Lord Megary's observations in John versus Rees, that what may appear to be completely indefensible may, when you look at deeply, would become, totally indefensible or totally, untenable. Sudhish Sudhish mentions that by the time the judgment came and the case was argued, hardly a few days were left for the period to expire. And Soli said, I am not interested in the facts, I am interested in the laying down of the law, which again showed that Soli never wanted judgments, to use one of his own favorite phrases, I have heard them, to be one-way rail tickets. Sudhish narrates another incident when Soli, as a young lawyer in the 60s, was arguing a matter before a bench of Justice Subbarao. He found the bench in his favor, but he also knew there was a recent judgment that covered the case squarely against him. Soli expected the other side to cite it, but they did not. The matter spilled over to the next day. Sleep eluded Soli that night. Following day as well, the opposite side did not cite the judgment. Soli, true to his cloth as an officer of the court, cited the case and tried to distinguish it, but did not succeed. The case was decided against his client, but Soli got a good night's sleep. There can be no better role model, no higher tradition of professionalism. One cannot not read out the tribute a person as venerable as Chief Justice Venkataramani, revered by the legal community all over. He says Soli was in a league by himself, a true legal philosopher, playing his part quite remarkable in endeavoring to infuse into public power a constitutional culture. Equally so in Epuru Sudhakar's case. I remember it being argued in Court 5 before Justice Pasayat. This particular, I think the Andhra government had passed omnibus orders pardoning, hardcore criminals. The question was, what are the parameters for judicial review? Soli argued the different propositions and which were accepted. Soli was amicus in the matter and highlighted two important aspects, one relating to the desirability of indicating reasons in the order granting pardon. Reasons, natural justice, and if you were around Soli, you could see him canvassing this. It still, echoes in your mind with Soli. The power to withdraw an order granting pardon, remission if subsequently material was produced to show that certain relevant material were not considered or certain materials of extensive value were kept out of consideration. Reasons are to be indicated in the absence of which excess of judicial review will be affected. Soli argued that considering the frequency with which pardons and remissions are granted, it would be appropriate for the court to lay down guidelines so that there was no scope for making a grievance about the alleged misuse of power. Impugned order was set aside and the state was permitted to reconsider it in the light so that, hardcore criminals do not get away because of their influence with the government. Chief Justice D.Y. Chandrachud, who was a young lawyer, briefed Soli in the repetitive ordinance case, the DC Wadhwa case, brings out certain facets and which must be highlighted. I had the privilege to assist Soli in DC Wadhwa. While researching into land tenures in Bihar, Wadhwa came across a phenomenon where ordinances were being repromulgated for years on end. Research developed into a book and then became a constitutional challenge. Soli successfully submitted that the doctrine of colorable exercise of power will apply to the office of the executive head. He also submitted that the repromulgation of ordinances, though arguably valid on a literal interpretation of the provisions of the Constitution, would subvert the democratic process by bestowing the governor with the law-making function. But this is the personal attribute of Soli, which I like the most in this court. Soli's conferences and preparation of court hearings were brief and incisive. I have been to a few of them and it will be very brief. At the back of the paper book would be the notings. And if it was a big brief which my senior Mr. Viswanathan would attend, everyone would get love letters in a cover. The propositions would be typed out and put and neatly sealed, and I don't know whether any of you remember that. It will be distributed and you need to work. There was so much clarity that, there was no complication, no unnecessary, attempt to complicate matters. That is what the Chief Justice brings out. Soli's conferences and preparation of court hearings were brief and incisive. Yet, when it came to a crucial constitutional case, Mr. Soli's conferences and preparation of court hearings were brief and incisive, yet when it came to a crucial constitutional case, he spent hours poring over the right formulation of constitutional principles. He was aware of the serious battle on constitutional values in that case and his role in fostering a constitutional order. His mastery over the former and awareness of the latter did not detract from his elegance, both in and beyond the court. of course, Mohinder Singh Gill, the issue was application of natural justice. Soli was for the Election Commission, but he took a fair stand that Justice Krishna Iyer said Sorabjee did with imaginative, with emphatic clarity and pragmatic yet persuasive advocacy belied the twilight yet sensitive zones of electoral law. Now we need to briefly discuss how Soli as a law officer was, and I don't have to go further than read Nani's letter. Much read about, but worth reading, because the youngsters, those of you here, I think this is the touchstone. Soli was fiercely independent as a law officer. After his appointment, while meeting the press, he had once remarked from the lawns of Motilal Nehru Marg that he was Attorney General for the country and not the government. His mentor Nani wrote to him, and I quote, "I meant to write to you to congratulate you on your appointment as the Attorney General. But after reading your public statement, I would like to congratulate India on having you as the highest law officer of the government." The greatest glory of the Attorney General is not to win cases for the government, but to ensure that justice is done to the people. 1979, Soli, as Solicitor General, appeared for the Union in the case of C.B. Muthamma, the first female member of the IFS who had filed a writ complaining that she was being discriminated against and denied promotion on the grounds that she was a woman. Justice Krishna Iyer said, "We have had the advantage of the presence of the learned Solicitor General appearing for the Union with characteristic fairness." See, this is where everywhere it will come to. And I think it is a good thumb rule to adopt that test everything on the anvil of fairness. In characteristic fairness, he has persuaded his client to agree to what we regard as a just gesture, that the respondent Union of India will shortly review the seniority of the petitioner, her merit having been discovered and her seniority in grade 2 being recognized. We direct accordingly. See, what is important also to notice is stature that Soli had, that he could tell the Union, this is right, this is what is to be done. Not just the Union. We will come back shortly to Justice Sri Krishna in the early 60s referring to labor matter, Soli appearing for a private employer, telling the private employer that this is what is the right thing to do. We shall briefly refer to that. In the prison reforms case in Sunil Batra again, the Constitutional Bench comprising Justice Krishna had decided that convicts in prison have fundamental rights and they cannot be held in solitary confinement with bar fetters for an unusually long period. Someone has referred it to as almost conspiratorial, they say, between Krishna and Soli to make sure that fundamental rights are guaranteed. Soli, who appeared as Solicitor General in the matter, argued to uphold the true essence. Justice Krishna has said, "So I am beholden to Sorabjee, the additional Solicitor General, who displayed commendable candor and benign detachment from his brief and shown zealous concern to advance the right of man, even condemned man, against the primitive drills behind the Iron Curtain, sanctified by literal legality." Then there is this famous reference to the written submissions of Soli, the first 4 paragraphs in TMA Pi, when he came in as Attorney General and said, "Look, I have appeared for one of the private managements, but now I am not appearing before you as union. If any of you have any doubt, please tell me, I will stop. But this is what I want to say so far as minority rights were concerned. How do you balance what is exactly, preventing maladministration, what is setting standards?" And Soli set out his submissions in such a balanced manner that the Constitutional Bench, again, Attorney General, pursuant to the request made by the court, made submissions on the constitutional issues in a fair and objective manner. We record our appreciation for the assistance rendered by him. We can't not conclude this without referring to Soli's view on secularism. Soli actually practiced secularism in his office. I am not going to refer to judgments. I need to only refer to Iqbal Chagla mentioning in his piece that for Soli, being non-communal was an article of faith, which showed in his choice of friends the company he kept. His chamber was crowded with lawyers from every conceivable community. And look at this illustration. This is what actually being a constitutionalist is. Once a senior Parsi solicitor complained to Soli that he should prefer Parsi juniors over others, to which Soli replied, "I take my juniors at their merit and not on the faith they espouse." All this is recorded. The Sri Krishna's instance, imagine in the early 60s, there was a case of a poor stenographer who was abruptly terminated from a publication house, and the matter came up. Mr. Sri Krishna took it up for the experience of it because there was no fees forthcoming. He says the matter was listed before a kind, considerate, equity-minded judge. When the matter was taken up, the publishing house was represented by Sorabjee and 2 other big counsel. The judge, visibly moved by the client's plight, interrupted and cut short the erudite submissions being made by defendant's team and suggested to first take back the poor stenographer, after which the issue of back wages would be negotiated. When the matter was posted next, to the horror of Justice Sri Krishna, he could hear the instructing solicitor whisper to Soli that nothing could be done in the matter. Please report to court. It was to the credit of Soli that he put his foot down, appearing for a private foreign publisher, and prevailed over the instructing counsel and the representative of the employer to take a humane relook. 1 hour later, they were back in court and offered to reinstate the client. Now, this incident demonstrates that Soli was not looking at it in terms of rupee anna pies or an ego. He was, the back of his mind, wanting ethical corporate governance even then. It is quite clear, this is my comment, that even then Soli was marching to a different drummer. Soli perhaps is an embodiment of what both Baba Sahib Ambedkar and Babu Rajendra Prasad, the famous remarks in the concluding session of the Constituent Assembly. It would have been read to you times without number, but in the present context, if I were to read it to you and you were to juxtapose the paragraph to Soli, you will find that Soli would squarely fit in to this passage. However good a constitution may be, it is sure to turn out bad because those who were called to work it happen to be a bad lot. However bad a constitution may be, it may turn out to be good if those who are called to work it happen to be a good lot. The constitution can provide only the organs of a state, such as the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The factors on which the working of those organs of the state depends on the people and the political parties they will set up as their instruments to carry out their wishes and their politics. Soli held a constitutional office. Soli appeared in court in several constitutional matters. Soli held offices as UN Rapporteur, which was associated with human rights. But in each of it, he brought to bear a conduct which upheld the constitutional values. And that is that part of the Soli which really makes him a devoted constitutionalist. And even if we were not to have a written constitution, as I said earlier, Soli would have been a constitutionalist. And I sum up with a passage from Mr. C.S. Viswanathan, senior advocate and my esteemed senior, who I think summed up Soli accurately in his tribute to him. Soli was a liberal. Soli was an artist. Soli was a public intellectual. Soli was also a lawyer. To confine and cabin Soli to law will indeed be doing an injustice to his holistic personality. I think that is what Soli was. I think we still miss Soli. I just want to conclude with one personal incident which still, rankles a bit. I think Soli was, those days, still active, but he was coming for few cases. There was a service matter in Court 3, and in the usual, Russian tumble, one gets excited, and there was one incident where in the course of the submission I let go a phrase, in the sense, not an unparliamentary one, but perhaps I wouldn't have had a second thought if it were any other counsel, but because it was Soli, I was very upset. So it was a Friday, driving back, I stopped on the road in Kelgaon Marg with near the florist, bought a bouquet, and I scribbled something, probably my handwriting let me down. I went to the Niti Bagh house, Soli was not there. I wrote a sorry message and I left it with the office staff. I never got any response from Soli, but I don't know whether Soli saw it. I don't know Soli whether realized it was from me. he never mentioned it. He never. So the 3 days down the line, there was a book release in the India International Center. So the tea is hovering around Soli to. I just hovered around once. I hovered around twice. Soli was at the table, in a round table, seated. The third time, I said, "Now I'll give up." I was passing by. Soli put out his left hand and then just, said hello. He never said anything. And I assumed that you should pardon me for that impertinence. And thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you for inviting me.
The recipient of the Soli Sorabjee Excellence Award and Scholarship 2023 is Pragati Thapa, LLB batch of 2020-2023 from Jindal Global Law School. Ladies and gentlemen, let us give her a huge round of applause.
We could not have asked for a better moment than to have this particular lecture. I'm going to keep it very short. This seems to all of us like a divine conference that we are here together to hear Honorable Justice Viswanathan speak about the life and works of Soli Sorabjee. And that's indeed an inspiration, the legacy that he left for all of us to follow and to emulate. And this is one such moment that as law teachers, as lawyers, as judges, as jurists in general, this is the moment that we need to capture, to commit ourselves to the rule of law and to reaffirm our faith in the rule of law and an order-based society, and make our contributions based on our respective occasions to this kind of a society that we all envision to have one day and continue to have one day based on the life and contributions of Soli Sorabjee. Thank you so much. And I also would like to take this opportunity to thank Justice Viswanathan for his time and efforts to be here with all of us today. And I also thank friends from the bar and distinguished members of the bench, in particular the judges from the Delhi High Court, the family of Soli Sorabjee, represented by Madam Sorabjee, and Satvik Varma for this important contribution. And I thank each one of you for being here with us. We know that his contributions are vast and seminal, so we need to have series of activities. And here we have a commemorative panel discussion or a seminar as well to reflect more on his works and contributions so that we can have strands of thoughts to work towards a better society. Thank you so much. I request you all to join us for the panel discussion.
Thank you, sir. We will now have a panel discussion. We are joined today by distinguished panelists, Mr. R. Venkataramani, Attorney General of India, Ms. Madhavi Divan, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, and Mr. Satvik Varma, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India. I request our moderator for today, Professor C. Raj Kumar, Vice Chancellor, OP Jindal Global University, to please lead the discussion.
Thank you very much. Quite remarkably, we are exactly at 12:15 when we should be starting the panel discussion. So thank you for our distinguished chief guest to have his lecture as well. May I request you to kindly join us here, sir, so that you can... Okay, all right. Fine. I mean, whatever has had to be said about Mr. Sorabjee has been so beautifully said by Justice Viswanathan. But what I thought we will do in the course of the next 35 minutes is to request my distinguished panelists here to reflect a bit more about his life, including their personal, interactions, experiences, and even, reflections about his life. So I'm going to start with Ms. Madhavi Divan. Madhavi, if you can talk a little bit about things that you have known solely from distance, but also more closely, but also to connect that with what his life and legacy means for young lawyers of today from your vantage standpoint.
Well, thank you. You can hear me, yes. I think most of you in this audience, or many of you in this audience, have probably seen Mr. Sorabjee, and I'm going to, in the Bombay tradition, I'm going to refer to him as Soli. But I think you have seen him in action much more than I have, and much before I joined the Supreme Court. But I will therefore restrict myself to sharing what I took away from him. The first time I heard the name Soli Sorabjee was when I was in my early teens, and in my neighborhood in Delhi, just down the lane where my parents still stay, there was a board which bore the name Soli Sorabjee. And I thought, well, what a weird name. I thought, what an exotic name. So I came back to my parents and I said, I happen to be Gujarati, so I am familiar with Parsi names, but it still sounded, there was a lovely alliterative lilt to the name. And I said, I saw the name Soli Sorabjee, and they said, well, do you know that he's the most famous constitutional lawyer. Of course, from my little universe back then, law was very, very far away. And I never imagined that I would even ever meet him, let alone get to work with him. But I would say that the measure of a great lawyer is not necessarily the kind of practice that he shores up for himself or herself, or the number of judgments that he or she has to their name. I would say that it's really what you leave behind and what you share with the bar, and whether it's in terms of nurturing a chamber, or even beyond that. And of course, as far as Soli's chamber is concerned, I think res ipsa loquitur, but I'll tell you what he did for me even before I had ever met him. In my very, very early years of practice, and I was a very unlikely lawyer, in my very, very early years of practice, it felt like, I straight from, with a law degree, I had launched into the chambers of Janak Dwarkadas. And, this was suddenly a very kind of amorphous, unstructured kind of a practice where, I wasn't getting a report card at the end of every term, so I wasn't sure of how things were going. And I was really looking to do something which was, I said, how can I contribute something different or new? And at the time, I chanced upon this, it is a short book on censorship by Soli Sorabjee and published by N.M. Tripathi. I'm told that even Tata Press didn't want to publish it back in the time. And it was on censorship in the emergency. And it made a very racy read. And I thought, it got me very interested in the subject of free speech. And I began to work on, of course, I didn't think of it as a book then, but I started working on pieces, and I started, trying to hone my writing skills. Eventually, of course, years later, it culminated in a book, and I owe that in so many ways to him, without his perhaps even knowing it. It so happened that I had the privilege of his writing the foreword to the second edition. So I think, it's his legacy. I mean, of course, I can't match or add to any of the erudition that Justice Viswanathan has shared with us, but it's really, I think, when I look back at him, it was his curiosity and his quest for excellence. I think that is what makes him stand apart, and I think he was never driven by what the profession had to offer monetarily. I think that didn't excite him. And I took away, I think last year from Jahangir, when he spoke at the first memorial lecture, he mentioned something very interesting. He said when he came to clear the house, after Soli passed, he said he found nothing of any great monetary value at all. But he found books and more books and more books. So, and I think here that says something about the man. And it's interesting that, about more than 10 years ago, he had actually introduced me to the library committee of the India International Center. And we used to attend these meetings, and I was quite amazed at the kind of patience and enthusiasm that he showed there. It had nothing to do with the law. And he was so passionate about his literature and poetry. And I think that interest outside of the law also informed his erudition and his ability to deliver in court. And I think that sometimes as lawyers we begin to, we're very doctrinaire, we're kind of blinkered, we're kind of hold into the system too much and we don't think outside of it. And I think that his out-of-the-box approach and I think his erudition came from there. So I think that is at least what I take away from Mr. Sorabjee.
Thank you so much, Madhavi. That was very, very thoughtful. In fact, we are very fortunate that several of those books that he had, Zena Sorabjee had kindly donated it to us, and it is beautifully adorned in our library and be there forever. So, let me move to Mr. Venkataramani. Of course, you are carrying that mantle of leadership as Attorney General. But I also want to ask you a question about the fact that despite the complexity of the job of Attorney General, where one is constantly engaging on extremely complex legal and constitutional issues, at times obviously controversial, he maintained a sense of equanimity at all times. And he was able to give that wise counsel and acted as Attorney General for India as opposed to Attorney General of India. And so he had this larger interest in the protection of the rule of law. How did he do that at some level? But more importantly, what are the possible lessons that one could learn from that fiercely independent mind that he had?
You are a hard taskmaster, huh? And, I must have a crystal ball ahead of me and to look back into the past and then look into the future. But I must tell you a very personal interaction with Mr. Sorabjee. As Viswanathan spoke about two important aspects of his life, about a giant who can weep and verbal violence. Samatha was a very important judgment for the rights of tribal people of the country. And it has huge implications for spread of human rights, for not only for the tribal people, but across a wide range of sections of a community. So soon after the judgment, it had some problems for the government. Mining areas, government discretion to look into mining areas, etc. So a suggestion came to Mr. Sorabjee, the Attorney General, to have the 5th schedule amended. And I came to know that he was seriously working on a proposal to have the 5th schedule amended. I had worked in this case from a very distance, but having traveled to different parts of the country, particularly the scheduled areas, and want to look at the concerns of the tribal people, I felt very passionate about it. Samatha must be protected. It was my very, very important concern. When I heard about this, I went I went to Mr. Sorabjee and said, please do not advise that the 5th schedule shall be amended. And I said, you must weep, this is what I told him, you must weep for the tribal people of our country. Then I reminded, he said, you know I have wept when ADF Jabalpur came. I said, weep the same way. He shook my hands and the amendment never came. I feel so happy in my life. I feel so happy even today. So when you ask me this question, how do you really, on a lighter side, just about 10 days before my appointment, I was appearing in Atta before the Punjab High Court. It's a case concerning Nixon's Anderson tapes and the special prosecutor, I think, Archibald Cox. The rule relating to removal of a prosecutor was that you can't remove him except without his consent. A new Attorney General came and removed the rule because they wanted to remove the prosecutor. The prosecutor was removed. So I was citing the judgment before the Punjab High Court to say what an Attorney General shall not do. not knowing that 15 days later I'm going to become the Attorney General. So I know, I understand that navigating constitution in the midst of turbulent period is a difficult job. But I don't say that we are in a turbulent period. It's much of an excessive statement. At every stage, I think, in the nation's history, some point of time, whether we are at crossroads. These are not crossroads which are final. They are transitions, movements. So if you have to write that post-emergency, because I think emergency is a thing which has happened to a country for good. If it does not happen, the sense of fairness and lawyers' commitment to fairness would have been probably very different. And that's where I also think Mr. Sorabjee's deep engagement in being fair and evaluating and engaging in fairness in all aspects of law. That somebody says if administrative law was constitutional law for England, administrative law has become constitutional law in a different sense for India. So this transition is very important, and I think emergency played a very important role in that. And all of us seem to be, I think, virtually inhaling what I call the values which is now post-emergency. And that's why we keep talking about constitutionalism in a way different from what would have been pre-emergency area. So, just to, I wouldn't like to say that as an Attorney General, I comprehend all the difficult roles I have to play, but the 1 year I've completed in this assignment, when somebody asked me weeks after I assumed this office, how do you feel in this office? I said, I'm beginning to learn statecraft. I think that's what I mean. Statecraft is what this office is about. And, but what is the statecraft? A whole lot of values go into it. And while you are a private practitioner, you look at law, administration, justice from a particular perspective. For all of us law officers, you are very valuable, experienced law officers here, and that takes you into a different domain altogether. That domain is how do you look at balancing wide range of challenging issues and concerns. And that comes essentially out of, again, a sense of fairness. If I'm not fair, I can't balance. So I think therefore, that's what we learn. I think the alphabets of being a professional. So and finally, I would say that when I go to law school, I keep telling the students, if you cannot understand the pains and anguish of those who are in the impoverished sections of the community, then you are not fit to be a lawyer. To understand and to weep for the rest of the community who deserve it, not weeping in the literal sense, but weeping in a philosophical, in a constitutional, and in a humane sense. I think that's important. I think therefore, Jindal, I hope, and suppose you would inculcate this ability to weep for those who are in the most deprived sections of the community.
Thank you so much.
Just before, we are part of a United Lawyers Association, which Mr. P.P. Rao nurtured for a long while. Just before Soli left us, there was a small meeting in IAC where we went to felicitate him. I was asked to do a small talk. I said, you're asking a squirrel to talk about a giant, but not knowing the squirrel will be called upon very soon to get in the shoes of a giant. And I wrote a small piece to him about a book I was supposed to publish. I want to share this, and his reply came back. I read it first, and I'll tell you what he wrote back to me. He's both concerned about freedom and all that liberty. I wrote to him a small piece of poetry. Freedom is a lofty thought. In freedom do we craft a lot. Freedom is a holy thought. In freedom do we earn a lot. Freedom is a field of sorts. In freedom do its ends we draw. Freedom is all creature's gift. In freedom do we write the best. These thoughts are old with chapters lot, but timeless inks ever wish to add. Commas and full stops for meanings more. Freedom is a skaty ring. A tiny slip is a fracture big. The plays are on, the plays are on. The screen does capture wrinkles long. Mr. Soli wrote back to me because I told him I would like to publish my book of poetry with a title, Reflection of an Immaterial Wanderer. He wrote back saying, your freedom and your thoughts will not make you an immaterial wanderer. I hope I go to publish this. You words with my book. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Venkataramani, for sharing those thoughts. In fact, building on that, Satvik, one of the things that Mr. Sorabjee was conscious of is that what kind of inspiration that he will remain, especially for the younger members of the bar. And at a time when, and he was of course very conscious of the fact that he's part of the profession and distinctly different from any form of jobs or avocation and things like that. So, and he was very conscious of the fact, and in later years, I've had the privilege to discuss with him about deterioration in the standards in the legal profession itself. So my question to you is that, how do we address this part of his vision, that at a time when we have moved in the direction of what I would call violating the vision of what Michael Sandel talked about, what money can't buy, the moral limits of markets, whereby legal profession is increasingly being defined by the ability to pay to lofty lawyers for their time, as opposed to the kind of public service commitment that the legal profession ought to maintain. How do we resurrect that? And the second thing I want you to address is the jazz bit. I mean, he was president of this Delhi Jazz Association for years together. He had this whole parallel life. Sorry? Somebody mentioned something? Okay. So he had this whole parallel life with this world of jazz. I remember one of my colleagues in Hong Kong, Professor Richard Cullen, he would spend time with Richard and another group of people simply on this aspect of it. Some of them are law people, but many of them are not, and do reflect on that as well.
I love how Raj started off by saying the young lawyer. I take that as a compliment, although we are just 1 year apart. I'm so glad that he brought up jazz, because so much has been said about Soli, but nothing was said about his love and passion for jazz. And his love and passion for jazz also reflected, we all know the Raymond's ad, and I think Soli was the best model for that, the complete man. Because he followed his love for jazz with the same passion and commitment that he had for human rights. You could start a conversation, my wife is from the arts, and he would engage with us post one of those dinners with him, playing jazz and talk about it. And her father used to listen to a lot of jazz, and those were just absolutely fascinating conversations. So to add to what Justice Viswanathan said, Soli was everything that he said, but he was also a true entertainer. His wit we all know about. And I think most people in this room would know, except for some, that Soli used to love to mimic. And I think if you caught him in one of those moods of his, post a couple of old pars, you would get that side of his personality, which was absolutely fascinating. And I don't want to take away from the seriousness of the conversation by playing court jester here, but really I think, the nature of the man, they really don't come like that anymore. I think they just don't come like that. So coming back, Raj, I'm not going to go against my profession and tell you why the lawyers are billing as much. I've sworn allegiance to the brotherhood. No, but I think before I go there, I also want to share a particular incident. I want to share an incident which dates back to late 2020. It was the middle of the lockdown. We'd had the second wave, and because air travel was restricted, there were not any members of the Sorabjee family, and Pritesh, Sridhar, and I and many others were called upon regularly. and I would walk across. We were 2 doors away to spend time with Mr. Sorabjee. And it's absolutely fascinating how that man's mind worked even at that age in the middle of a pandemic. And when Soli would talk in Hindi, would mean that he was really very emotional and passionate about something. I think he was cognizant of his Hindi not being the best. And Soli sat me down and said, "Ye kya ho raha hai yahan pe?" So I didn't have any context. I said, "Sir." So he says, "What is this issue? Look at what's happening with the migration and the migrant workers." And he says, "How can the states prohibit people from one state coming into another?" I think, just to refresh everyone's memories, certain states where there were higher numbers were restricting. And Soli was pained and he said, "Kya ho raha hai? How can they do it?" So I said, "Soli, I don't follow." So he said, 19(1)D, free movement throughout the country. Are we in a state of emergency? So I said, "No." He says, "I read, and can you confirm under what rules the pandemic has been declared?" And when I told him that it was under the NDA rules, he said, "The Constitution cannot be given a go-by-to." And he says, and he called a couple of people in front of me in my presence. And there was an article published the next day on exactly this issue, that despite the pandemic, 19(1)D, which allowed for free movement of any citizen, especially those migrant workers, were not suspended. And so that is, the man. I also got a little lucky because of that proximity, that when the house was being cleaned up, I don't think I'm deserving of it, but Auntie Zina asked if I wanted anything, and I got one of his gowns, his senior gown. So when I got still, the first gown that I wore, I wore my father's jacket for 37 years, and Soli's gown was the first gown that I ever wore. I think I've rambled on too much, so we'll come back to your other question.
Yes, thank you so much. I should respond to one of the things you said when you spoke. I was wondering why more men are here and more women are here, and I'm convinced that most men were pretty lazy to walk all the way here because we were asking everybody to move here to start with. So that's the explanation why more women are here. All right, Madhavi, over to you. Madhavi, the thing that Soli did, and unlike many lawyers of current generation, is that he was very comfortable to wear different hats. So he was a very devoted lawyer, but he was also writing and reading and publishing, and was very conscious of this academic rigor and intellectual engagement that he had. He, of course, was delivering lectures across institutions. And then he was also deeply committed to, which I said in my remarks, into international law and international human rights law, and working closely with many UN organizations. He was actively engaged with the civil society movements as well. So in some ways, he was so deeply embedded in all aspects of intellectual, civic, and of course, lawyerly life. Is that something that lawyers today do at all, as you see from the profession?
So I'll share with you, when I started writing initially, inspired by Soli, this is a little nugget that my husband Sham shared with me, who also started in his writing in his 20s on the law, of course, environment law. But he said that someone had shared with him this little nugget of advice that successful lawyers don't write, and those who write don't become successful. So he said, just bear that in mind. If you start writing too early, that's if one gets successful, then you'll never have the time to write anyway. So, but that is actually something that Soli was able to break that. But having said that, I think I see, of course, for years you never saw lawyers writing, but I suddenly see this efflorescence of writing among young lawyers. I think one is sitting in this room. Gautam. I do see some really good writing. But of course, as far as Soli is concerned, he was just an incredible juggler of roles, which he kind of, they kind of coalesced into his brilliance as a lawyer. And I remember Justice Viswanathan mentioned about how much he enjoyed the media. So I remember the first conference with him. It was a case called Karamara shipping, which eventually culminated in a judgment of the Supreme Court where we lost. But Soli had been part of this case even in the Bombay High Court. And he was really larger than life. And when he held court in his room in Niti Bagh, I remember this room packed with lawyers, and I found a sort of very remote corner somewhere in the room. And it was a I think a marathon 3-hour conference, but it was interrupted by all sorts of the news crew, these television crews would come in and thrust a mic into his face, and they would take a news bite, and all this was happening in the middle of the conference. Then calls would come, and then someone said Rashtrapati Bhavan, they want to talk to you, and all this was happening in the midst of this 3-hour conference. And I was probably barely, not even 2 years into practice, and that too in the Bombay High Court, which is very staid, and I think lawyers comparatively lead a very boring life there. But I was just in wide-eyed wonder. So, he seemed to, he was such a sort of, a sparkling media star. He sort of juggled all those roles. And apart from that, I think as I said in the last round, his scholarship and his delivery, I think, was informed by his the fact that he was straddling so many different roles and spheres. So I remember at some very lovely evenings at their home, I once met the chairperson of the then the Judicial Appointments Commission in the UK. And the matter in the Supreme Court was on at the time. So these insights which you got were just priceless, because and I immediately, of course, Mr. Arotki was the Attorney General at the time, and I immediately scribbled down everything I had, when I went home, and I shared it with him the next day. And I think that, it at least made our arguments much more. So I think these various roles, and then he was so passionate with the Commonwealth Law Conference. And every single time, he attended, I think the last time at Livingston, 2019, he couldn't make it. And you will be amazed. At the moment you said you're from India, they would ask you, but where is Mr. Sorabjee? So, he had such a fan following across the world, and I think, that made him really very, very special.
Thank you so much, Madhavi, for those wonderful reflections. Let me ask Mr. Venkataramani. Mr. Venkataramani, one of the things that we are all very, inspired by Mr. Sorabjee's work was he always spoke truth to power. And the role of a lawyer to be able to speak truth to power in different settings, especially as Attorney General, but also otherwise, does not necessarily put him or her in a comfortable position at all times. So my question to you is that what kind of lessons that we can learn out of Mr. Sorabjee's life when he has maintained that level of intellectual integrity and rectitude even under difficult circumstances?
You are asking me a question for which I need to wait for a little more time to answer. But let me try to answer. Well, at one level, for me, it's a little theoretical. At a different level, it's practical. Firstly speaking, one looks at the movement of national, political, social, and economic contours. One non-globalized situation to a differently globalized situation. So the pulls on the government and the needs of governance have become vastly different from what it was probably even a decade ago. And what the role that a lawyer can play, whether in the private practice level or as an institution. I think all of us are an institution, whether you are in private practice or in advisory capacity for the government. So the role of lawyers as an institution has also become very different today. I consider that we are not hired guns in the sense that Lord Rohan talked about it long ago. So the role of the fraternity of law as an institution is very different. Then we have to play complementary roles. I am no longer tied to an adversarial system. It no longer demands my attention from taking points of view. So therefore, to be able to be a neutral umpire and to have more than one perspective and to weigh them on a golden scale, I think that's what the professionals will learn today. But I'm not very sure that we are doing it very consciously. We are still trying to everyone strings as an adversarial system. So if you have to move away from that, I think we need a radical paradigm shift. I'm trying to capture in my own little humble capacity the dimensions of this paradigm shift. And if possible, try to reach out to all legal education institutions. You are heading one of the premier institutions. And I think, how can this paradigm shift take place? That's why I keep reminding myself of a very important understanding which Professor Manan always used to share with me. And both of us were with him. And you learned a whole lot of things about legal education and the institution of being a lawyer. So he said it's important for us to move from looking at law as a legal education, but towards justice education. And what does it mean? I've been trying to understand its meaning for quite some time. And slowly it dawns upon me that it means that we have to do a lot of fundamental radical changes in the way we draft legislations, in the way we understand the impact of legislations in the lives of ordinary women and men who are far, far removed from lawmaking process. I'm talking about them. So if you have to talk about the role of professional in the institution, we need to look into these aspects which are least noticed. So justice education, what do we mean by that? So I think the role of an Attorney General, I don't want to talk about what I would like to fondly do in the period left for me before the next elections come, right? But I would like to do something before, so that in the office of Attorney General, on the day when I assumed the office and went and sat in the chamber in the Supreme Court, I keep telling about it. When I go to all the photographs of all the Attorney Generals lined up there. So I sat in the chair, which has been run by all the predecessors, who've been great, illustrious lawyers, right from Settler onwards. They asked me the question, I am here. Am I here? So the question went loud in my mind. I began to ask the question every day. What am I going to do by being here? So that I think I would like to answer by saying that if the institution of law, the practice, will have to undergo radical changes, we must do something about that. And that can be done by asking the government to get deeply involved in its fundamental radical transformation. And I must tell you, to the credit of the government, to whatever extent I think I've been able to persuade the government in some of the exercises they want to do, the government is giving me a free hand. And one important initiative we're discussing with Professor Raj is that the administration of criminal justice is the most, least looked at point of administration of justice. We look at it very closely. Therefore, we need to look at institutions which can probably advance the ends of administration of criminal justice more vibrantly. And one of the ideas is shared with the government, and probably I would ask all the national law schools and legal education institutions look at it closely, namely that we probably look at setting up institutions. One example would be an institution of National Institute of Criminal Justice Administration. We must look at many of the areas of law and be able to involve the legal fraternity in, as it becoming, as I call, not legal professionals, but justice professionals. These are the ideas which I think must gain root in the very study of law. The study of law must undergo a change. It's not really a question of syllabus, but look at the connection between every branch of law we study. And I'm sure Vice Chancellors who are here to wear more hats than me will probably look at it more closely.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Mr. Venkataramani. And that also takes me to one more question for you. Mr. Sorabjee was very conscious of the democratization of the legal profession at a time when at least the first 3 to 4 decades of post-independent India saw legal profession being largely led by people with parents and grandparents being part of the legal profession. Today it has dramatically changed. In fact, our own law school, I'm happy to say that at a time when I went to law school in Delhi University, I would say more than 50% of the students had direct family linkages to legal profession. Today at our law school, over 75% of our students come from no family legal background. And that's an enormous, tectonic shift that has happened. So my question to you is that, how do we build that part of the legal profession so that we can also aim to fulfill the vision of Mr. Sorabjee when it comes to having not just greater merit, but also more a democratic and inclusive legal profession?
So Raj, I must give the disclaimer before I answer that question, which I will, that my grandfather was one of the original, he was an agent in the federal court, and he was one of the 20 people who inaugurated the current Supreme Court. My father is also a senior, so I'm not sure I'm the best person, but I will still attempt to answer that. Before I do that, I want to just pick up on what the learned attorney said, because he talked about a very interesting concept, not something I've heard before, and he perhaps used words that are just slightly different from what Justice Viswanathan said. The attorney used the word justice education, and Justice Viswanathan talked about testing everything on the anvil of fairness. So, at least for me, the two are the same. And I just want to make sure that that thought is understood, at least by some of the younger people in the room, that justice education is not altering our legal education, or at least that's my takeaway, sir, but is building on the anvil of fairness. And just to finish the loop on that, Justice Viswanathan talked about the GMA Pi case. Based on my reading, Mr. Sorabjee in that case was called upon, and he did present every side of the argument and not just the side of the government. And he says so that my duty is towards the Constitution and not the government of the day, which is very fascinating, because this is something I've heard him say. I've asked him, I had many questions. I continue to have many questions. But with Mr. Sorabjee, because I never saw my grandfather, and he, in some ways, was that elder person 2 doors down. And I asked him, I said, not many people are reappointed as Attorney General. You served, under a second term. And he said, yes, but I'm not the attorney for the government. So it is for India. But Raj, coming back to your point, and I won't dwell too much, I feel that this profession has changed, and for the better. I feel, and you're sharing data with us, 70% or 75% of the people, if they are not from the legal profession, I think we're almost there. Madhavi is not from a legal background. The prolific writer Gautam Bhatia doesn't come from, none of my office colleagues are from legal backgrounds, and they're absolutely great. And I think that there's a couple of things that have changed within the profession. One, I think live reporting, and we have Pallavi here from Bar and Bench. I think just the interaction between people, citizens, and the law, in my view, has come a lot closer. And because of that proximity between the citizen and the law, there is a lot more awakened curiosity amongst people who are choosing their profession. I think the lure, and I would be sort of in denial if I didn't highlight, I think the profession has become extremely lucrative now. But I still want to leave everyone with the thought that despite everything that, Justice Viswanathan said in the opening lines of, he was champion of human rights, he was a defender, he was also a very successful lawyer financially, Mr. Sorabjee. Mrs. Auntie may differ, but he was, and I think it just goes to show that it is not one or the other. You can pursue the holistic goals of the law and yet achieve and earn a great living. So I think we're there with contributions and the role that Jindal Global Law School plays, and I think things are developing and there's going to be so much more.
Thank you so much. We are indeed coming to the...
Yes, and the attorney, as Justice Viswanathan just shared with me, is also first generation law.
We are indeed coming to the end of this session. Fascinating. I'll have same question to all three of you, starting with Madhavi. Madhavi, if there's one value that we want to take out of Sorabjee's life and legacy that matters to you most, what would that be? And briefly reflect on that.
Well, I've said everything else, but so I will emphasize now on freedom of speech as a value, and I think why he put so much emphasis on it was that this is the foundational value which informs other fundamental rights, and which is that as human beings, as a human species, we engage with one another through language. That is what sets us apart. And if freedom of speech and expression is fettered in any way, it impacts human engagement, the exchange of ideas, and therefore the evolution of other values, whether it's equality, fraternity, liberty, and so on. And so I think this is the fountainhead of those foundational values.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
I think nature indulges in diversity. Diversity is one of the fundamental values of life. Freedom of expression is part of diversity. If diversity doesn't exist, we'll all be Robinson Crusoes with our Man Fridays. So, look at the diversity. I begin my reading of the Constitution every morning and close it every evening. Look at diversity of life, diversity of values. Because every thought can be sometimes a ripple, but it can also be a ripple effect. So therefore, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I want to say that let us put it together in a larger canvas. So if diversity dies, nothing remains.
Thank you so much. Over to you.
The one value that I take away and admired the most about Soli was he didn't take his success too seriously. He didn't let it get to his head. And we've talked so much about law, and there's some non-legal people here, but really the value that I take away and that I would like to inculcate is that he wanted success. He knew who he was. He just didn't let it get to his head. He was just, and therefore it left me with the thought that to be a good lawyer, we all need to first be good human beings, which Soli was. So that's my value.
Well, thank you so much. And I should say that 3 days ago, Madhavi had sent a message saying that, Raj, do we have some moderator questions? So then I decided, okay, let me prepare a set of 5 moderator questions, and I, pre-released a question paper 3 days ago. And, but then, like a good professor, I almost asked all out of syllabus questions today, and these 3 people were. So the 3 of them were absolutely amazing. So thank you so much, Madhavi, Divan, R. Venkataramani, and of course Satvik for a fascinating panel discussion. I really appreciate your time. I of course want to thank our Honorable Justice Viswanathan for a truly inspiring lecture that you gave about the life and legacy of Mrs. Sorabjee. I also want to thank all of you for your presence here, and bar and bench for covering the proceedings, and of course Zena Sorabjee for your presence and participation. I want you to have the right of refusal. Would you like to say the last word in this session?
I really can't add much except talk about him as my personal feelings. Soli was very warm. He liked to crack jokes, and often he pulled not only my leg, but also the leg of my daughter. And we didn't sometimes know when to take him seriously. He would say something in such a serious tone that we believed him. And as you said, he also meant it. And so sometimes on the telephone, he would pretend he was somebody else. And so I would answer to that. And then he would say, "Oh Lord, you can't make out." I'd say, "Yes, that's difficult." So Soli was just very, very warm. He didn't have much time for the children, so that was up to me to look after them and see that they grew up well. But when he gave them time, he gave them good quality time. And of course, at the dining table, it was always some talk about law. He was on the phone with some solicitor, or he was just talking about law, and my daughter got inspired by that, so she took up law. And she's fulfilling the role that Dr. Raj Kumar said, it's in the family. Her children, I don't think, will be practicing law. Her daughter is a lawyer, not practicing, so that's the last one. Thank you so much.